Hello, this is the Christian Resistance. My name is Josh Brister, and I'm pleased to be joined today with a number of scholars, scientists, all included. I want to go through the list here. People that I've been reading, and I'm sure a lot of my listeners have been reading and listening to the various arguments they present. First of all, we have um, I'm not sure if I say it right. Sarah Salviander.
Salviander.
Okay. We have James Sinclair and we have Sy Garte. Sarah, I want to start with you. Just briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners why you think science refutes atheism. Why you think this is an important podcast, a reason for our viewers to listen in.
Okay. I was raised atheist in a secular country, Canada, by atheist parents. So I was raised to believe that, there's no God. Religion is just kind of a waste of time. And I had a strong interest in science as a kid. My parents encouraged that. So spent a lot of years in university becoming a scientist. And so it surprised me as much as anyone else when halfway through my PhD, I became Christian. And that was very much in large part because of the strong evidence that I saw for God in my own work. It was just shocking to me. I became a theist quite unexpectedly and then started investigating the Bible and Christianity and found that it held up to scrutiny, became Christian. And then my focus shifted more towards talking to Christians, talking to people about this wonderful confluence of science and Christianity. And that's been the focus of my work for a long time now. And so to me, it's almost to the point that it's shocking to me when people say that science disproves Christianity, because it's quite the opposite. I see science as being very supportive of the Christian faith and vice versa, that Christianity actually is very supportive of the scientific worldview. So that's my story.
Great. And we're definitely going to get into that more, how design in the universe, how physics, how the beginning of the universe, the complexity of the universe shows design. And I think this is also interest to you, James Sinclair. I want you to introduce yourself. Why do you think this is an important topic? And why do you think science refutes atheism or speaks against atheism? Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I'm James Sinclair. I'm a physicist. I work for the U.S. government. What I do is I have pretty sophisticated computer models of the real world. I don't want to get detailed beyond that, but we deal with a lot of different disciplines. I'm probably the smartest person in the room because I'm constantly interviewing PhDs for the various portions of the model, modeling different elements for how the world interacts, shall we say. And so what I really am is I'm good at seeing what the value is in a certain subject toward answering certain questions. Okay, so in a computer model, you're still posing questions, except it's against a model of the world as opposed to the world itself. So you're constantly in a situation where you've got to evaluate the model, work out bugs, artifacts, and try to have it match the real criteria against the real world as best you can. So that's what I do for a living. So I'd say on the major issue is, can science refute atheism? I would put it a little bit different. I would ask the question instead, is atheism empirically coherent? Is it compatible with science? This is more of a philosophical bent. Science is generally treated as, by because we can do things like build iPhones and build bridges and send people to the moon and things like that, it has a lot of respect as a knowledge generating activity. But the key thing behind this we got to keep in mind is it's still a derivative knowledge generating activity. It's not an original. Okay, it operates under, it's dependent on rules. Those rules are metaphysics. As Christians, we would point back to God as the creator, and we would say that God created the world in such a way that there's secondary causes that are at work, the laws of physics. And from that comes what I call capital E evolution, which are things change with respect to time according to the laws of physics. And that's what we study. But still, science is derivative of those metaphysics. And so the major thing is metaphysical principles would be something like, we expect the world to be coherent and possible to study. That we can actually go out and find simple laws of physics to explain things, so we can build bridges, iPhones, send people to the moon, etc. But scientists generally operate as if that, especially on the atheists, the way that I've seen in my experience, they ignore the fact that you're operating under that larger metaphysical background. So what you get, and if we go into that today, if you look at the various arguments for the existence of God, and you put on your red teaming hat if you're a Christian, and you say, look, how could I disprove these premises if they're positive arguments for the existence of God? You often end up in a skeptical dead end. You often end up that if you argue in favor of atheism in order to defeat one of these premises, you end up sawing off the branch that you're sitting on, and you end up in what I'd call a state of pure skepticism. Or similarly, a premise might be, you might be able to refute a premise, but you end up having to do it by disproving that science works or that it's a practical activity. So what you see is, in argument after argument for the existence of God, like we talked about last time we did a video, the evolutionary argument against naturalism. That's a good example of it. Should our faculties, even if the world is comprehensible, should our faculties have evolved in such a way that we can understand the non-apparent character of the world? That's Alvin Plantinga's argument, which reaches back to C.S. Lewis.
Our faculties are truth-seeking, and it just seems that under naturalism or under atheism, it seems almost a miracle that we strive for truth, and our perceptual faculties of seeing and touching and comprehending the world is intelligible in the first place. So it just seems to me that, like you said, we live according to first principles. Thomas Reid talks about this, the Scottish philosopher in the 18th century. He says, we live according to first principles of common sense. And I think it's really in the realm of common sense where atheism falters. And the difference between common sense is nonsense. And I think that's what the atheist has to go for when he rejects God or the intelligibility of the universe. So I'm sorry if I cut you off, James.
No, that's a good segue.
Okay. Thank you. I have last but not least, Mr. and Dr. Sy Garte. This is your second time on this program, on this podcast, and I thank you for being back. Can you tell us just briefly a little about yourself, and then why you think this is an important question, and how Christianity and science are compatible? They're not incompatible, but they are compatible. And I'm reminded here how the originators and developers of the scientific method were explicitly Christian. And it was because of fundamental theological doctrines like the intelligibility of the universe, that a creator had created a rational nature over a rational plan, that we could discover laws that governed the physical universe. Could you talk about that for a moment? Sorry.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back. I often say that Sarah and I are brother and sister in Christ, and not just in the usually commonly used sense, but like her, I grew up in a very atheist family and was an atheist from birth and throughout my childhood, throughout my youth, and only came to believe in theism in my middle age. And then, like her, I read the gospel. I went to a church a few times, eventually became a Christian. And also, it was my studies of science, first chemistry and then biochemistry, and also knowing a little bit of physics in between, where I suddenly realized that the materialistic atheistic view that I had could not be right. And eventually, as I said, became a Christian. And like her, like Sarah, I devoted the rest of my life for the last several years, starting with the last several years, to exploring and talking about and writing about this issue of science and Christian faith. So that's my background. As I said, my PhD is in biochemistry, and I did research at several universities for many decades. And everything that I studied, everything that I learned was pointing me in this direction. What I would like to say is I really like the title also, and I would actually like to extend a little bit what Jim Sinclair was saying about this whole idea of atheism and science. What I find very interesting these days is a great deal of science denialism by atheists. It turns out that, that there's this meme, this myth, which has been so prevalent that everybody knows about, is that it's science or faith. The two are opposite. You can do one and not the other, but you can't have them both. They're in conflict. All of this is, as you just said, Josh, is nonsense. Historically, it was never true. It's a myth that was made up. And the proof of it is, I first realized this when I discovered that there were atheists. First, I thought it was just a few who were claiming that there's no such thing as a code in biology. That the genetic code is not a real code. It's just a metaphor. It's simply false. And it's provably false by looking at any textbook in molecular biology. It's just nonsense. And then I found out it's a fairly widespread belief. And not only that, I found out that there are atheists who are claiming online and, wherever, that the universe did not have a beginning. Okay, so they're going back against anything from science that is pointing towards the existence of a designing creator. No genetic code, no beginning of the universe. In other words, what we now see is not Christians saying science is wrong. We're seeing atheists saying science is wrong. So, in fact, what this really shows is that Christian faith is in line with scientific discoveries by non-Christians, by non-theists, and atheism is in denial.
Yeah, I often feel that because of the theological implications concerning the beginning of the universe and concerning the reality of the genetic code, atheists tend to try to explain away the data in however fanciful and speculative terms. It doesn't seem plausible to me. But Sarah, what do you think what Sy said? Because there are these myths floating around. And one of these myths that science and Christian faith are incompatible actually started in the 19th century with Andrew Dixon's White book on that tried to show a conflict between science and theology. So what do you think about that and what Sy said, Sarah?
What do I think about this myth of the warfare between Christianity and science? Well, it's just that. It's a myth. And I read a wonderful book. In fact, I've got it right here. Let me pop it out because this is something that everyone should check out. The Soul of Science by Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton. Right. It's a wonderful book that talks about, it really goes through the whole history of the development of modern science. And a lot of people get kind of hung up on technology, which is not the same thing as science. They'll say, well, what about the Egyptians? What about the Chinese? What about the Romans? What about, they can be wonderfully technologically advanced. That's not the same thing as the methodological, scrutiny of nature, which is modern science, the scientific method. That is a direct product of Christian society. And that's just a historical fact. Mm-hmm. Just looking at it from that perspective, and the ideals and assumptions that have to be in place before there's even the possibility of developing science. And what you find is that a lot of those come from the Christian faith. This idea that nature is real, it's not an illusion, which there are worldviews that hold that what we perceive is actually an illusion. Mm-hmm. So you first of all have to believe that the world is real before you have any motivation to study it. That you have to believe that nature is worth studying, that you can trust your senses, that there are things like logic, that the universe follows a set of rules that don't change, because if they do, if nature's capricious, how could you study it? Because you study one thing one day and the next day it's something completely different. So all these ideas that it's lawful, that it's orderly, that it's knowable, that we can actually study it. And then the final thing, which is a very Christian idea, which is that we have a duty to study the universe, to understand it. Why? To better understand the mind of God. These are unique to Christianity. And what a lot of atheists come back with is, so you're saying that you have to be Christian to do science. Well, you needed these Christian ideals and assumptions in order to have the possibility of science in the first place. That doesn't mean that other people can't do science. It doesn't mean that other cultures and traditions haven't contributed important things to the development of science. The mathematics, the philosophy of the Greeks, that you have inductive and deductive logic, things like that. But the necessary ingredient was the Christian faith. So it's just impossible once you understand that to hold this idea that Christianity and science are at war. They're very much intimately related. One gave birth to the other. And then the other thing is you look at stuff like Rodney Stark wrote a wonderful book called For the Glory of God. And it's about a lot of different things, but it includes a chapter on the development of science. And what he points out is when you look at the key architects of the scientific revolution. So this is the revolution that started with Copernicus in the 16th century. And then it culminates many years later you've got figures like Newton. And so he found this list of the key figures of the revolution, and he looked for a secularly composed list. I think he used Isaac Asimov had come up with a list of these important scientists, so it wasn't religiously motivated. And he researched the religious views of these people, and so there was 52 scientists that he identified. And out of these 52, how many would you guess were Christian? Just guess.
51.
You're close. You're really close. A lot of people say like maybe 10 or maybe half. It was 50. Okay. And so there was one that was, I think he was not able to identify what this person was. And then I think the sole atheist on the list was Edmund Halley of Halley's Comet. The rest were Christian. And of those, 60% were what you would consider devout. These people were very Christian. This was the major part of their lives. And 40% of them were a little more conventionally Christian, just, we go to church on Sunday kind of Christian.
Mhm.
That's an amazing number, 50 out of 52. And if Christianity and science are at odds, this could never happen. It's just a myth, and all of the evidence points to the complete opposite.
Yeah. And a lot of sociologists and historians have recognized that science, as opposed to craftsmanship or engineering or mathematics, that science originated in Western Europe and nowhere else. The book that you were referencing, it wasn't just a good guess. I have the book, For the Glory
There
of
you
God.
go. There it is.
Yeah, I'm not that good of a guesser. I've actually read that, and it's a great book. Rodney Stark. I want everyone who's listening to this, Rodney Stark, or what you mentioned, The Soul of Science, by Nancy Pearcey and Thaxton. There's a growing number, including Ronald Numbers. There's a growing number of scientists, of historians, of sociologists who recognize that science originated because of fundamental theological doctrines about the intelligibility of the universe, of trusting in our perceptual and cognitive faculties. So I think you bring up a good point. I think all indications is that we live in a theistic universe, and I know you've written on this. You've written on this a lot, on the design of the universe. But I want to go to James now. James, I know you've written on this in this book right here. This is for our listeners. You wrote a great article, not an article, but a great paper with William Lane Craig on the Kalam cosmological argument, and how the beginning of the universe shows that it was caused, and it's a conceptual analysis of the cause shows that it was God. But you've also written on the fine tuning of the universe. How do you think the beginning of the universe and fine tuning of the universe, revealed that from your paper? How does it reveal God, or theism rather than atheism?
Okay, so with regard to the Kalam argument, the real value of the Kalam argument is it, as opposed to, say, the design argument, which has its own virtues, is that it shows that there's not just a creator, but a transcendent creator. That in a non-geographical sense, I don't mean that I point to heaven and that's where God is up in the sky, which is the simplistic view that of distorted Christianity that some people have.
Yeah, caricature.
We're saying that in an ontological sense, that there is a creator which transcends the universe. To get back to one of Sarah's points and why science was so compatible with a Christian-led society, it's because you believe from Christianity that the world is God created, but it's not God. So the fact that it's God created gives you an idea that it's comprehensible and possible to study. The fact that it isn't God, so we're not pantheists or panentheists or something like that, means that we're not committing blasphemy or sin by studying. The world is still a thing which you can analyze in a laboratory or through a telescope, and that it's worth doing. So, and we can see from that both the creation and the design of the creation. So the great value there is, you said, Kalam shows transcendent creator, and especially the cosmic design argument. There's many design arguments, but the one I work with is the one that's based on the laws of physics and the masses of the particles and the force strains and all that. The same one that Luke Barnes and Garrett Lewis are working on now. I wrote a paper in 2018 with Father Robert Spitzer on that. What that shows is that, okay, if we expect the world to be intelligible, what do we see when we analyze these different force constants, the force strengths, things like that, do you see something that's compatible with an accidental or materialist worldview? Or does it seem like we were created and created for a purpose? And what it seems over and over again, and philosopher John Leslie's good at this too, a special book he edited called The Mystery of Existence. What you see is not just that all these parameters of what we call the standard model in particle physics are extremely fine-tuned so that you're just not going to accidentally end up with them, but they're all you look at each one of them and they tend to be fine-tuned for 5, 6, 7, 8 purposes simultaneously. So for example, a multiverse might explain, if you give me an infinite multiverse, the first part, okay, I'll roll enough dice, I can get a life amenable universe. But the second part is not explained by the multiverse. Multiverse doesn't have power to deal with that. So these two arguments together, you put that together with the resurrection argument, and that is probably your best argument going forward. Maybe Sy Garte, I'm sure you're involved in, are you involved? I'm just still getting to know you. Are you involved in the the fine tuning of life, the design argument for life, for example?
Absolutely.
That would be another major one. Stephen Meyer,
Yep.
Intelligent design movement. So you put all these things together, and they show a positive case for how science, if you follow the philosophical arguments, can point toward a creator. And then, as I said earlier, if you try to refute that, if you do what I call, exit ramp atheism, where you're driving down the highway and you look for the first excuse to get off, what you find is that all the excuses to get off, the multiverse, whatever, lead you to pure skepticism. For example, I was taking some notes while Sarah was speaking. She was talking about comprehensibility of the universe. And I just wanted to mention one thing about how the multiverse, using this exit ramp atheism, leads you to complete nonsense. There's a philosopher out there named David Lewis who in the 1980s came up with this idea of a contrafactual multiverse, where the argument goes something like this. So if science is comprehensible, I'll go back to Sarah's point. So I'm Isaac Newton and I see the apple fall from the tree. And what is science? It's about repeatability, right? It's about, I bring Sarah out and I say, hey, look, the apple falls from the tree. Maybe gravity's going on here. So I expect a repeatable and intelligible experiment. But when you get into these multiverse concepts, what Lewis came up with is this idea that you could have an infinite number of universes where all the way up until the present, you have histories that look like evolving laws of physics, or an evolving universe from laws of physics, all the way up until the apple falls from the tree, and then you get complete chaos. Okay? And in fact, in philosophy, this is a position that's called the regularist position, that there aren't, the opposite is the necessitarians that believe in real laws of physics that cause things to evolve. But the regularists, using this counterfactual technique, believe that you can have situations where histories are not reliable, the future is not reliable. So you end up, well, if that's true, then you just cut off the idea of science. Because what is science? I go into the laboratory, I expect the apple to fall from the tree, and you're telling me that, no, you're just one spot in this multiverse where maybe the history looks regular by accident, but the future's wide open. There's no reason to expect that it's going to obey a rational and predictable history going forward. So, yeah, I'll stop now. I just wanted to follow up on some of Sarah's points.
I just wanted to say I often point this out, something similar on the principle of sufficient reason, that we all in every day of our lives and in 1,000 times a day look for reasons or explanations for different things. But it's very convenient that it's only with the beginning of the universe or the explanation of why the universe exists rather than just nothing that the atheist conspicuously says, well, it has no explanation. It's simply a brute fact. Yet, with all the occurrences of lived life, the atheist has a ready explanation for everything in the world, except the ultimate explanation of why anything at all exists. So, the philosopher Ed Feser has used this type of argument from the principle of sufficient reason to show that if you don't have an intelligible principle of sufficient reason all the way down for why the universe exists at all, then anything, any cause in the causal chain will simply be inexplicable and without a sufficient reason. Be that as it is.
Right. So you end up, that's Kalam's first premise. It's also part of the Leibnizian argument. If you can have processes where things just pop into being, then, or pop out of being, and it's not even random, that's even a false way to put it, because probabilities don't apply to reasonless processes. Mm-hmm. Then you can't do repeatable science. So can you believe that that's the case? Yes, but you can't use science as an authority. And if you're using science as a club to go beat up the theists, you no longer have that club the moment that you embrace reasonless processes.
And if you deny the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, if you deny that, it seems that the atheist is in the realm of magic. If he's going to say that things can literally pop into existence out of nothing, out of non-being. So it just seems, bad metaphysics. I want to get back to you on the design argument and also with Sarah, but Sy, Darwin, okay?
Well, let me actually continue with the design argument, because design is critical in biology. And I just got back from a conference in Houston on apologetics, and I was the one speaking on an argument for God from biology, which struck many people as strange. And it should strike you as strange, because surveys have shown that the scientists who are most atheistic are biologists. And the reason for that, as Josh just said, is even though there's a lot of design in biology, nobody can deny that. The atheist view, first articulated by Richard Dawkins, is that that's apparent design. It's not real. And the reason is evolution. Okay, so the idea is that evolution can create all this apparent design. You don't need a creator. You don't need God. Whether that's true or not is irrelevant, I believe, because what is really true is that while evolution could, or in some cases might, easily explain some aspects of design in animals and plants, one thing that evolution cannot do, and this is indisputable, and it's agreed to by everyone, including Dawkins, it cannot explain the origin of life. Okay? This is very analogous in physics to, we can understand a lot about how galaxies form, black holes, for example. We have an expert right here in Sarah. But nobody can go back before the Big Bang, okay? Before that, we have no idea. And that's true in life as well. We cannot explain the origin of life through evolution. It doesn't work. You need evolution to get to the kind of life that we now, a kind of cell that we call living. And this is what I talked about. Looking at the origin of life has been incredibly revealing as something that it absolutely refutes atheism, because without a designer, a transcendental and designer, I think it's impossible, but it has certainly been extremely difficult for non-theistic scientists to get anywhere close to how life could have possibly originated. I'm not going to go through those arguments because they're very long and detailed and technical. But the arguments are very clear, and there are now many non-theistic biologists who are starting to weigh in on the idea that we're not going to get there. We're not going to figure it out with the tools that we now have. We're going to need new tools. We're going to need new concepts. And I agree with that, of course. And that's the area that I'm working on. I've actually published a couple of papers in that field to show that it's since you need evolution to get any kind of life, and you need life to have evolution, it's basically a circular argument.
Yeah. It seems to me that evolution can be understood as one of the best arguments for the existence of God, because it seems that it has a final cause in mind. There is no reason to think that the evolutionary processes should develop life, but there's so many amazing coincidences, from the anthropic principle, which you alluded to, James, to amazing coincidences in the cell, things that Darwin did not know. Darwin did not anticipate this design in the cell.
Let me say one other thing about evolution that it cannot do, although people try to make it do it, and that is explain us. There is nothing in biological evolutionary theory that can explain why we're here talking to each other in this way. In other words, the incredible gifts that humanity has, the gifts of intelligence, of language, of creativity, of art, of humor, these things are not evolutionarily explainable. Now, people try. I mean, they come up with very nice stories. Well, back in the savannah, it was selectively advantageous to, think and to come up with ideas. Well, to an extent that may be true, but it doesn't explain who we are. If you take out the concept of the image of God, which of course is true, it's almost impossible to explain human behavior, human morality, even human worship. So, evolution is often misinterpreted as, especially by atheists, as the answer to everything related to biology, including consciousness. It's a fallacy. It's not true. It doesn't work.
It seems like the great hope of the atheist. It's a Hail Mary. Just to mention the word evolution, and let's see what happens.
That's it. We're done. Right.
Yeah.
And these are usually people who don't really know the biology and the biochemistry of evolution. It turns out that the biochemistry required to have evolution is incredibly complex. And this is what I talked about at this conference. I mean, there are systems for protein synthesis and the translation of the DNA code into specific amino acid protein sequences, which are beyond anything we could even imagine constructing ourselves. They're so complex. But all of these had to be there before you could have evolution working. So how did they get there?
Yeah, and why is the universe set up according to a law-like structure rather than a chaotic one at all? The law-like structure of the universe seems to imply theism. It seems that you have to be, reaching for straws to say that, to explain the law-like structure away. Sarah, you've been listening patiently. You've heard a lot. What do you have to say about James presenting the Kalam cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and design even at the biological level?
So let me understand the question. You're asking me what I think of. I'm not sure I understood.
Just, do you have anything else to add on to what James or Sy said before I get into another question?
Yeah, it occurs to me while I was listening to all of this that, what atheists often do is they'll take an individual thing, like the Kalam, for instance, and they'll attack one or two of the premises and say, well, there's this much of a chance that it's wrong, therefore I'm just, I'm not gonna, it's not forcing me to believe in God because there's this much of a chance that it might not be right, which is strange enough in itself to me. But what I've come to realize is that the real power of all of this is the cumulative weight of all of these different arguments. And so not only, you've got the fine tuning, the teleological, you've got Kalam, you've got the incredible evidence for design, like from biology. It knocks my socks off to think about this. Just a single living cell, just the amount of machinery, the ingeniousness of it, it just absolutely dwarfs anything, the most sophisticated machinery that human beings have ever come up with. But you add all of that together, and by far the best explanation for all of this is a transcendental, God, an intelligence, a purposefulness, and just for atheism to explain all of this. So you say, okay, so you've got design, you've got, Kalam, you've got all of these different things. Now let's add in morality. Let's add in the evidence for Jesus Christ and his resurrection. All of this. What is a coherent, atheistic explanation for all of this? Okay, something that doesn't have internal contradictions, something that is consistent with the physical world, that is consistent with all of this evidence. What is their coherent explanation for all of it? They don't have one.
Right.
All they can do is these little attacks, these little nitpicks, kind of on the fringe of all these things. Well, maybe, the multiverse, maybe this, that. They don't have anything cogent to explain all of it. We do. That's our advantage.
It's very much like I have two dogs. They're named Honey and Sugar. It's kind of like, a Chihuahua biting at your feet. Just stop it. That's how I'm picturing it. Just look at the whole cumulative case. I mean,
yeah, Josh, you could ask Sarah or I about Chihuahuas biting at our feet on Twitter. We can give you lots of stories.
yeah.
Well, do you remember? You remember what R.C. Sproul? I don't know if any of you followed him. I followed him for a long time. What he used to say about this is say, if it really is Chihuahuas, or it's the example of the emperor has no clothes. But the reason you don't speak up is because the objections that you get to the premises of the arguments require PhD level scholarship. Yeah, what Sproul would say is you have to be a PhD to believe some of this nonsense. like the B variant of time, like the static nature of time as opposed to the dynamic time, or in multiverses, or one of these things after another. Or Sy brought up consciousness for a second. There's this, like the classic Christian view, something called substance dualism. Okay, but so what do, if you want to believe that the mind exists but you're atheist, there's this view of something called property dualism, and it ends up being nonsensical because if we just go there for a second, what they say is that this is a thing that just emerges and it supervenes, which means dependent on the physical, and it has no causative powers. And if you go look at arguments like Victor Reppert and C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea, and he was also in that the Blackwell Companion book that Dr. Craig's and my article were in, he'll say the variability to even reason or to have truth states. How do you have a hunk of meat in your brain be in a truth state? Okay, that is not something that is compatible with pure materialism. There has to be a mind which is non-physical in order to do that. So when you get into, there's just another topic, and there's just one after the other. We could just go through all of these. To believe in property dualism, you have to believe in, first, there's this wacky emergence that doesn't have an explanation. And then doesn't have causation anyway. But the thing is, in order to reason from premises to arguments, which, by the way, is part of science, which means it's necessary to practice science. So if you believe science is your authority, you have to be able to do it. That's incompatible with property dualism. So where are you left with? Either eliminative materialism, which is even worse, or you go to substance dualism, which is the Christian but also larger theistic view. So again, it's this exit ramp. Give me an excuse so I don't have to follow the path, which ends up in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. I think we're talking about explanation and the comprehensibleness or the thoroughness of Christian theism, how it explains a wide variety of data, not just cosmology and physics, but astrophysics, chemistry, biology, psychology, history. In all that, you could say it functions, all those fields of study functions according to laws. Now, what explains the laws? Something rational must explain those laws because they're at the initial beginning of the universe. Atheism doesn't have an explanation. They say it's merely a brute fact. And of course, no one lives that way. So I think a commonsensical understanding of reality, a person who is not doesn't have a PhD or an education on all this, but the average person, I think, can rightfully reject atheism because it simply doesn't explain all the various facets of lived life, of what makes a person a person. Sy, do you have anything to piggyback on what I said or what James said or what Sarah said about the comprehensiveness of theism, the multi-layered explanation thoroughness that Christian theism provides, rather than the simplistic explanatory abilities of atheism?
I think Sarah wrapped it up beautifully. And this is what we do in science. We don't take a single fact or a single experimental result and say, well, now we know everything. We take the weight of the evidence. We do several different kinds of experiments. We use several different kinds of approaches. If everything points to the same thing, great. Then we have a theory, and then we keep looking at it. And what she pointed out was that there are so many arguments, there are so many facts and so many ways of thinking that point to Christian God, historically, scientifically, philosophically. The weight of the evidence is there, and this was part of my own journey to faith. It took me a long time because it was unlike Sarah. I didn't get it right away. It took me decades before I saw that there was accumulating case going around. And the last part of that was, was looking into what Christianity actually said, because I didn't realize what Christianity was all about. And again, finding the evidence for the resurrection, and then actually having some experiences with the Holy Spirit directly, that made it clear. Okay, it took me a while, but I eventually got there. So yeah, and what James was saying about consciousness is,
did we lose him?
This conference was Josh Rasmussen, who's a philosopher who is really interested in the philosophy of mind, and I was lucky enough to have some discussions with him. And this idea that the mind is the result, as Jim said, as the result of this emergent property of neurons, which are cells, which themselves don't do much, but they're in these huge networks. Well, what does that mean to be emergent into a mind? How does that happen? And, emergence is a great word, but we don't really know what it means. Okay, so in other words, people say biology emerged from chemistry. Okay, what does that mean? How does that happen? And, I think that all of these events, all of these emergence events, including and especially the mind, are pointers to the God we worship.
Yeah, like signposts that point.
Signposts, right.
We're living in this gigantic maze, but we see all these signposts that are pointing to something.
That's right.
Pointing to something above and beyond mere finite, contingent, material factors. I think y'all have all highlighted various points. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, you did a lot of research on black holes and teleology to help me understand this, and as well as our viewers. How is that a signpost? How is that an indication of divine design, the black holes?
That's a good question. And it's something that I discuss in my chapter of a wonderful book called The Story of the Cosmos. So black holes are one of those things that people love black holes because they're extreme. Hey, there we go. Thanks, Jim.
There it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was put together by a couple of editors, just a wonderful collection of essays. And so, I had to give some thought to that. What's the relevance of black holes? Because they're neat, they're really extreme. And as an astrophysicist, I'm, for whatever reason, attracted to really extreme phenomena. I study quasars, which are active supermassive black holes. And so it's reasonable to wonder, are they for anything in the universe other than just being really cool? And so it turns out that they do serve some important purposes in the universe. And one, which is they appear to help regulate the growth of galaxies. And why is that important? Well, if you get too many stars, if you get these massive galaxies that have a lot of really bright stars or a dense concentration of stars, it's difficult for life, here's that word, to emerge on, around a star and on planets because you just simply got too much radiation. So these supermassive black holes in galaxies, when they go through the quasar phase, which is they're actively feeding on material, and then just this creates a lot of activity around the black hole, and this energy, this momentum coming from around the black hole can sweep out star-forming gas in a galaxy, shutting down the growth of that galaxy. And that turns out to be important for at least one galaxy in the universe that we know has life in it. So that's one purpose. The one that brought me initially to theistic belief was just that they allow us to study deep cosmic history. And for me, there's from a naturalistic point of view, there's no reason for that to be. The incredible amount of these things that had to be in place in order for us to answer the questions we were trying to answer. When I was working at UC San Diego, I was part of this cosmology group that was trying to figure out how much normal matter there is in the universe. And this turns out to be, you can test it very sensitively by looking at the proportion of something called deuterium to hydrogen in the early universe. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen. And when you measure the ratio of deuterium to hydrogen in the early universe, that tells you how much normal, as opposed to dark matter, there is in the universe, which again is another sensitive test of the Big Bang model. Okay, so in order to test this, you need to be able to look far back in cosmic history. Well, there's a lot of stuff in the way, but we can have a pretty clear view. And in astrophysics, distance is time. So you want to look far back in time, you have to look far away. We're able to do that. Now, we're able to look at the chemical compositions of things in the early universe because each element, each isotope has its own chemical signature. That's another thing. In order for us to look far back in time, we need a light source that we can see from billions and billions of light years away, because this is how far back in time we want to look. Well, we have these incredible super bright light sources called quasars. We need them to have a spectrum that has relatively few features so that we can see the chemical compositions of the clouds that they're illuminating. Well, that, all of these things are in place. And it just struck me, how likely is it that just a naturalistic universe that doesn't care about us, that doesn't care that we want to understand things, would yield up all of this, and so that we can study, its contents, so that we can answer these esoteric questions. Like, is it vital to survival for us to know how much normal matter there is in the universe? I mean, you can't explain that from an evolutionary perspective. Why are we able to understand the universe on this level? And so to me, that was absolutely mind-blowing. But we can do this thanks to these supermassive black holes. Now, the final thing is, I like to call them the guardians of chaos, because it turns out that the vast majority of the entropy, this is kind of a measure of the chaos or the disorder in the universe, is locked up inside of black holes. And so you think about a star, you've got a very large star that has come to the end of its life. And as the dying process, it's going to collapse in on itself. And in the core, it forms a black hole. And then the outer layers of that dying star get blown off into this beautiful supernova remnant. Now, if all of that energy, there's an incredible amount of energy that is locked up in that core, that is locked up in that black hole. If that was released, that would be very destructive. It would be difficult for structure to form where that was. And instead, all of that entropy gets locked up into the core of that black hole. And so this is how you can get a universe that is decaying with time, because there's no question that's happening. The universe is winding down. You've got the second law of thermodynamics, but you lock up a lot of that entropy, that decay, from that decay inside of black holes, which allows structure to continue forming, including the development of life. So it turns out that black holes are quite vital to the development of the universe.
It's nice. It just shows the discoverability of of who of design. It seems like that's another argument, the anticipatory aspect of teleology, how we can discover. I'm trying to put this in words, but it seems like there's another aspect that we were made to discover, or we have the ability to discover these things because of our position in the universe. And so that's really amazing. James, you're a physicist. Do you have anything to add to this? I think what Sarah was talking about included some aspects of the anthropic principle. Can you enlarge on talking about the anthropic principle and on what Sarah was talking about?
Well, one of the main things that I got from your article, Sarah, there's this, and I think you just mentioned it also, that when stars explode, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been 3 generations of stars. Is that right? Okay. So where do we get the components to build life? It comes from star explosions. It comes from the process that you're talking about, right? So you're intimately right in the design argument there. And I have a presentation. When I used to talk about how all the forces are finely balanced, the example that I would use is the sun. So because everything is so delicately balanced in these stars, but Sarah, you'd be perfect for that. You should absolutely write the design paper if you haven't done so already, because that's exactly what you do. And that's just what I'm thinking is that it shows all of these balances between the electromagnetic force, the weak force, the strong force, and gravity, and how if you mess with them with 1 part in 10 to the 40th or something here and there, you end up with disaster. You end up with stars that are incompatible with life, or you don't get stars at all, or you only get black holes. The nature of stellar collapse, what you do, I just say it's so intimate right before the cosmological design argument. It'd be great if I propose to do a paper with you if you're interested.
Sounds great.
I wanted to get back to something that Sy said. We're jumping around so much. You mentioned emergence, because you have this conference where you were at, where was it Rasmussen? Was he the philosopher, Joshua Rasmussen? Yeah, I talked to him. Okay, emergence shows up all over the place, and it's like this magic process.
Right.
Usually the kind of argument you get is, oh, here's how emergence works. Why is water wet? Then you go and start talking about, well, physics is far removed from that. We're talking about atoms and molecules, and somehow there's this thing, wetness over here that happens, and that's clearly emergent. And if you actually go in, though, you can explain through the bonds and how the weak or strong they are, about how you can get solid state physics. And you can get those properties. So it's not a good example. They'll do that, or they'll do something in solid state physics, like, with electron flow or something like that, the absence of an electron can appear like a positive charge. And they'll say, look, I can mathematically build these models that show that the structure actually looks like this, and it looks like there's positive charges doing this thing. So they'll say that there's this structure that emerged when it's not really there. It's just a mathematical model. So that's the kind of examples that they use. But what really happens, I'll get back to the Kalam argument and the debate that Dr. Craig had with Sean Carroll at the Greer Herd on God and cosmology. So the interesting thing about that is that Sean Carroll had, as part of his debate team, one of the great philosophers of time, and also this very idea of emergence, called Tim Maudlin. And Tim Maudlin is very conversant in physics, and so he discusses these. The thing is that he was secretly, his position is of the idea of emergence is actually more toward our side of the argument rather than the atheist side, if you read his papers. And unfortunately, this never got discussed at that debate, but I'll discuss it now. The idea let's talk about Sarah and singularities, which are a black hole that starts the universe is a singularity. Okay, that's the Big Bang argument, right? A time reversed black hole is a lot like the Big Bang. Is that correct, Sarah?
Yeah.
Or at least mathematically it is. Okay. Well, atheists, what you'll see is that sometimes they like infinities and sometimes they don't. Okay, so if they're talking about infinite multiverses, then infinities are great. If you're talking about a singularity where everything collapses down to a point, they'll say, no, that's clearly a party foul. That doesn't apply to a beginning of the universe. So what they'll say is, okay, and sometimes I'll agree with them, there's probably quantum gravity kicks in at that point. There are some models which say that the physics doesn't get extreme when you get back toward the Big Bang, that they can still explain it with various models that do that stay in the realm of general relativity. But most of them say, no, you get extreme curvature, you get a beginning. And then the question is, what is the significance of the beginning? And this is the kind of research that I was doing for that debate back in 2014, and then none of this stuff ended up getting discussed at all. But where physicists are going is this idea of background independence. What is background independence? It's a way of saying that space-time is not a fundamental property of nature, that rather it emerged somehow, which means it's not fundamental, which means any conclusions you based on it don't count. Okay, you see where I'm going with this? So where do you end up with that? Okay, that's where you get into these modern theories. They're getting really, I'll just say, out there in terms of their consequences. And this is where you got an atheist philosopher of time, Tim Maudlin, is saying to put on the brakes here. He's saying, we just talked basic quantum mechanics for a second. You know that there's this idea, it's called the Copenhagen theory, that you have that nature is really waves, right? It's all about waves, okay? And then if you do an experiment on it, it does this thing called collapse of the wave function, and you get particles. And that's where the what we call the classical universe comes from. So this is our scientists in the lab doing our experiments, and boom, I just looked at something, I looked at the watchpot boil, right? And get collapse, and then, that's where the classical universe is. Okay, well, at least that interpretation of quantum mechanics is compatible with the idea of science. But the idea about this background independence is, no, everything is just waves out there. And that's the nature of reality. And the idea of space-time is this emergent, it's this derivative property, and it's not real, okay? Now, can you see where I'm going? I've already gone 3 or 4 examples of this. The moment you do that, what are scientists sitting in laboratories doing experiment, banging on the apparatus, okay? That's the classical world, all right? A lot of philosophers, when they talk about empirically coherent theories, that's what they mean. So that the two buzzwords in the discussion philosophically about whether this works in now we're talking about quantum cosmology, not just quantum mechanics, is the dispensability or indispensability of space-time, and the other is it empirically coherent? Because you could come up with the most beautiful theory of the world, that we're all just a bunch of wave functions, and if you can't do science in it, if you can't match that to scientists sitting in laboratories banging on equipment, the physical universe, with conscious entities capable of agency, by the way. Don't give me this fatalism stuff. If you got a theory that just goes pure fatalism, then you're out to lunch also, because then you can't do science. We have to be capable of agency. We have to be able to pick the experiments. Okay, what you're doing is, with this idea, is that what Maudlin will argue is that there's no connection between a lot of these theories and the scientist in the lab. There's another philosopher named Richard Healy who argues similarly about some of these theories, especially when they argue that either time, purely atemporal universes, that either there's no time at all, time is not fundamental to reality, or you get static versions of it or something. So what I'm getting at is, if you go out like I've done, because I do it so you don't have to, when you go out and look at what are the objections that you get to the basic Thomas Reid common sense of, look, causation is real, time is real, physics are things change with respect to time, and they endure over time, and they change over time. And that is what physics and reality is. In order to go on one of these atheist excursions, what I call the exit ramp, you've got to deconstruct reality somewhere. And usually when you do that, you end up in one of these contradictions where science, maybe even consciousness, isn't possible. So what I say is not that we refuted atheism through doing a science experiment on black holes or something, but what you can show is, if you go there, you're empirically incoherent. Well, science is perfectly coherent with a Christian, or even in the larger picture, a theistic worldview.
Very good, very good. I'm very happy that you brought up Thomas Reid and the dictates of common sense. His inquiry into the human mind, 1776 or 1784, was very wonderful. He replied to the atheist, in his case David Hume, that doubted causation. He believed in causation, throughout his daily life, throughout his affairs of whatever he does during the day in the marketplace. But when he's at his table in his study, he writes all these things about how we can't trust causation. It's just a bundle of perceptions. And
that's where David Lewis comes from, by the way. I mentioned him earlier in the talk here. That's where his counterfactual analysis comes from. That's called a Humean viewpoint.
Yeah, and that Humean viewpoint is that Thomas Reid view of common sense, of which you spoke about. Theism is the commonsensical position that takes life as it is, takes the experiments, the physical universe, and doesn't try to abstract it to where we can't even deal with it. And there's never been a person that's ever lived in such an abstracted universe where it's purely mathematics.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason that it seems believable is because, as R.C. Sproul said, it gets so far into obscuration that it's difficult for the ordinary person to look at that and say, I know that's wrong. You say the emperor has no clothes. And that's what we're trying to do here today, is illuminate this for the general person and say, look, if you go over there, it's just pure nonsense. That's where you end up.
And that's the opposite of common sense. Theism is on the side of common sense. In atheism, I believe when you look at the facts of lived life, is on the side of nonsense. Because that's not to say anybody is a nonsensical person. No. I'm saying that the philosophy, taken to its logical conclusion. Sy,
I'd love to jump in here because, I think I have this idea that it's sort of a prophecy maybe, or a prediction, which is that in all fields of science, whether you're looking at, cosmology or the standard model for particle physics at CERN, or in biology, where you're looking at, in just unending complexity and various gene regulatory networks, not to mention the origin of life. None of this goes well with atheism. And the title of our talk here, How Does Science Refute Atheism? What we're starting to see, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this, is that we're starting to see atheists refuting science. Because then what's going to turn out, and this is my prediction, in the next 10 years, atheists will be anti-scientific. They will be attacking science because science is going to more and more point in the wrong direction. I use the example of the genetic code, and I was astonished when I first saw this idea that it's not real, because it's the first time I ever heard it. I mean, I taught it, I learned it, and I checked all my textbooks, and they hadn't changed. So where did this come from? Well, it came from the fact that the existence of the information in the genetic code and the way it's interpreted and translated by a non-conscious cell points absolutely to a divine designer. And how do you refute that if you're an atheist? Well, you could try to say maybe there's some other way this could happen, but that doesn't work. So now they're just refuting the fact, the scientific fact of a genetic code in every cell.
Yeah.
And as I said, this is happening more and more in different fields of science. I think it's a harbinger for a big shift, which we're long overdue for. I think this period that we're in the end of, where, science seems to be aligned with atheism, is going to end. And it was a brief period in history. We're going to go back where, Maxwell and Faraday and Boyle and Pasteur and all the scientists, who were deeply devoted Christians, that's where we're going back to. So,
I'll give you an analogy that I think, if we get back to what Sarah was saying about intelligibility and Richard Stark, I think what it was. So things are great while you're living in the Christian society, but now we're in the post-Christian society. And when a train derails, in the first few seconds after it derails, things still look pretty good. We could still be sitting in the dining car ordering food. But we're now in the post-Christian society, and just what you were saying, Sy, is what's happening. Is that, okay, well, now you got atheists on their own, but they're not moored to the original metaphysics anymore. So they don't have to obey it, and they can go in all these wacky directions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you're starting to do exactly what you explained. The train is derailed. If you don't, to mix metaphors, right the ship, eventually it's going to tumble down the embankment.
Right. Amen.
That's why I think we have to let first principles of common sense, like non being can't come from non-being. Things don't just pop into existence out of nothing. These are first principles of common sense, which Thomas Reed, who you mentioned, talks about.
But Josh, let me break in for a second, okay? Common sense, I agree with everything you said, but we have to remember that science doesn't always follow common sense. Okay, sometimes there are things that seem counterintuitive that we discover in science. Mm-hmm. So it's both common sense and it's the science that we're discovering that are involved. So it's not just common sense, it's everything we know.
That's true. Do you guys remember a group called the Blue Man Group? They used to perform in
Las
Vegas.
Yes, I do.
They're still doing it. But if you've ever been to their act,
yeah, I went once.
That's exactly the point that they make. Okay? And the point that they make is that as evolved creatures, it's a lot like Plantinga's point. There's no reason why we should be prepared for modern society. And everything should go to chaos and nonsense. Right. And so what they're trying to say is don't believe what you see. They're trying to get you to, they're actually doing a disservice. They're trying to take you away from the idea of common sense by making that point that sometimes in the non-apparent world, and this is, go back to Sarah's article where she's talking about scientists after scientists didn't believe in white dwarfs and the neutron stars and the black holes because it's non-apparent reality. It didn't seem to make sense to them, right? Okay, so yes. That's true. And this is R.C. Sproul's point to come back to it. Our faculties, get back to Immanuel Kant also, what Sproul would say is that our faculties are basically reliable and common sense is often a good guide. You need a reason to move away from it. And so you've got to look for people like the Blue Man Group who are trying to say, you know what, because I can show you this one example of how your eyes see at 60 hertz and therefore I can do optical illusions or something, that you shouldn't believe what you see. And because of that, bait and switch, go believe this ridiculous thing. Okay?
Yeah.
That's kind of so you gotta be careful of that message also.
Yeah.
Okay? If it's a choice between common sense and the bait and switch, then I'm gonna choose the first principles of common sense by Reed, which also means we have to be open to new findings in science and not let our prior experience dictate.
That's right. That's right.
That's in Reed Wood, an expert on optics in the 18th century. He would go along with that. Sarah, we've discussed a lot. I think one theme is how there are multiple levels that show atheism to be false. Now, I want to quote to you Shakespeare. I love this quote in his Hamlet. Hamlet says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Now, when I'm in dialogue with atheists, I'll often use that quote. What do you think? How would you sum up the multi-level explanatorial way that theism provides to account for the rich variety of phenomena in the world, and how atheism merely is short-sighted in a number of respects? What would you say to that? Or maybe you want to comment on any of the previous discussion.
Well, I think you just kind of summed up what you wanted to say very well. I'm not sure that I could elaborate on that, but I did want to speak to something that Sy was talking about, which is very important. Now, this is the I love science crowd, right, with these atheists. And it's almost like I think it was Bill Craig who called cosmology a religion for atheists. And it's a big part of why I went into science, because it was the only way that I could sort of feel this transcendental awe and sort of this explanation for why things are, because I was not raised with religion. But the problem is, like Sy points out, they're going to abandon science when the more they realize that science is on the side of theism. And I've disturbingly seen this in the field of physics, where you do get people now, because of the popularity of the multiverse hypothesis, because it's really not testable. How do you test something that's beyond the universe? You know, we can only test things that are in nature, and the multiverse is by definition supernatural. It's beyond the universe. And so as a result, they're saying, well, does science have to test things? Does it have to include the empirical? And you do get a couple of big names in science saying, well, maybe empiricism is overrated. Maybe we don't need to be able to test something in order for it to be called science. Now, to me, that's pretty dangerous. The whole foundation of modern science is testing stuff. It's empiricism. It's you come up with these models, you come up with ideas. Well, you have to test them to see, because many times in science, we've had an idea of something, makes perfect sense. We've gone through the deductive logic, and then when we test it, we find out the exact opposite is true. And then we have to revise our hypotheses. So if you can't test something, it really shouldn't be called science. But you do get scientists calling for a completely different standard. And so now there's a big debate. So you've got Sean Carroll, who's he's a physicist that William Lane Craig has debated, and he is, if I'm not mistaken, is saying, maybe empiricism is overrated. We don't need this for science. And then you've got the physicist George Ellis. He's a South African cosmologist, brilliant guy, very much a believer, who is opposed to this idea and saying, no, empiricism is the foundation of science. So already you're seeing exactly what Sy is talking about, the abandonment of science because it supports the theistic worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like there's a deep antipathy towards theism. And with the abandonment of science, I think that you are predicting, and I think we're seeing now. We're starting to see now. You see a lot more this political correct talk, and I think that accounts for the rise of such things as wokeness, or these different things in our society. Political correct talk, but.
Yeah, so how do you move the subject out of the obscurity? I won't pick on Sean Carroll; he's a good guy. But if you're arguing that, okay, there's these level 3 multiverses due to quantum mechanics out there, which are just a big wave function and all that, and there's how do we pull that back so that we can talk to the ordinary person about that? Now, I can say things like, okay, I've been down that road, and I can see that's a dead end. All these, the exit ramps, I said, end up at dead ends. You can say things like, yeah, okay, so I've been down background independent theories, or string theory is a great example, Sarah, what you're talking about. You can't test it, but it's beautiful. It's a lovely theory, right? So, how, I'll ask all three of you, how do we bring that into the realm where we can discuss this with the ordinary person? Now, the thing with the Big Bang, the reason the Kalam argument took off and it became as big as it did is because it's something that excited the popular imagination. I mean, heck, there was a TV show with that name for, 11 years or something like that. I don't know if they ever discussed the Big Bang Theory on it, but it definitely captured the popular imagination. And so because of that, I could talk to the ordinary person about the beginning of the universe. What it's difficult to do is talk to them about some sophisticated multiverse thing that's going on over here. And meanwhile, you've got Sean Carroll-like PhDs saying, yeah, that's definitely what's going on. And theism is falsified. That's our challenge. And I say, you all are good communicators. How do we communicate this effectively?
I'll let y'all. Do you want to go? You can go first, Sy, if you want.
Well, I just wanted to say I agree with you, Jim. It's really hard, and I mean Sarah and I, who are both, and there are others scientists as well, not that many on Twitter, but in various other, media and other ways, are trying, but it is very difficult. And, we do the best we can. I mean, I don't have a golden answer for that question, but, this is not just up to us. It's up to the Lord. It's up to the Holy Spirit. And I'm very confident in the divine powers of God. And I'm confident that we will see an awakening. And, we're not there yet. We're still at the dark part of the early morning, okay, before the dawn. And I'm not going to give up. I know Sarah's not going to give up. And, we just have to keep pushing and keep trying. And eventually that message will get out.
Sarah?
I agree. I don't think I can add much more to that.
Well, you got 30,000 followers on Twitter. You're doing something right. Now, what is it?
Amen.
Trying to do things a little bit out of the box. And I was thinking about that the other day. Why do I have that many followers? And I had a couple of tweets go viral. And I think it was because I tried to relate also on a personal level. Growing up, I wasn't allowed to watch a whole lot of television. My parents were pretty strict about that. But one show that I was allowed to watch was Carl Sagan's Cosmos. And it really captured my imagination. And part of that was because it was really a show that was centered around Carl Sagan's personality. He was a really charismatic guy. And he had this deep love for and reverence for the universe, which is a beautiful universe. It's worthy of our awe and admiration. There was something about that because it touched people on such a personal level. And really, I think that's what people are after, is a connection with the personal. And I think we need to bring that in. And there's a tendency as scientists, because, you have to be a little bit dispassionate as a scientist. When I'm working on my scientific papers, I've got to take my emotions out of it as much as I can, because that can obscure the truth. But once we've done that rigorous process, then it's time to bring the personal back into it. How do people remember things? When there's emotions attached to it, when you make a narrative out of it, when you make a story out of it. This is a big reason that Jesus spoke in parables, partly because it makes the ideas easier to understand, but because you're going to remember a story much more than you're going to remember some abstract principle. And so I try to make things personal as much as I can. My personal story of how I went from atheism to Christianity, my personal story of how I've dealt with difficulties in my life by relying on God, things like that. And it seems to resonate with people. Also trying to inject a bit of a sense of humor in there, because really we're all kind of ridiculous, so you might as well have some fun with that. And, and this is why I don't it's never out of a sense of meanness, but I like to kind of poke fun at atheism because it's silly. And a lot of the things these people say are very silly. And so I kind of try to have a little sense of humor with it. But I think that's what we need to do is inject personality into this, humor, stories. This is how you can relate to people who aren't scientists.
Yeah. We've been going for about an hour and a half, and I think that's a good wrap up. I also want to say worldview analysis, how we look at a worldview, the implications, and how we live our life have a lot to do with it. Under atheism, there is really no hope. Atheists sometimes say there's subjective hope, but how can there be subjective hope if there's no objective standard, a transcendent standard of goodness, hope, truth, and the beautiful? There's these transcendent things that we all live by. So worldview implications have such a such a way how a person lives their life and how they function and how we interpret reality. Science needs to be understood in such a way. You can't simply abstract it away from the observer, the individual. with their cognitive and sensory limitations. We always have to take that into account, and we can't live according to it's purely mathematics and abstract it to that level. Under theism, there's multiple levels of reality, and I think God is the one who holds those multiple levels into existence. So that's why I think there's a multi-layered explanatory benefit to theism over and above atheism. Guys, it's been so great having.
Before we end, Josh, if you don't mind, I really like what Sarah said, and I actually did publish a book about 2 years ago. It's called The Works of His Hands. It's a scientist's journey from atheism to faith. And it does try to use exactly Sarah's formula. There's some science in it. It's my own personal story. And I've been encouraged, as Sarah knows, I will now make it public. I've been encouraging her to do the same thing, and hopefully she will. I think that will be a fascinating story as well. And so we will have a biologist and a physicist with interesting parallel stories. So, yeah, I absolutely agree that, and this goes to Jim's original question, how do we communicate to the public? And yes, we have to tell our stories. We have to include the story of Jesus Christ, which is the overwhelming story of all. And we have to see how we weave science into that.
Yeah,
stop there.
Nothing else has importance unless we're doing this for the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And nothing else matters. That is of the utmost importance, and gives importance and meaning and everything to the sciences, to everything. Jim and Sarah, do you have anything else before we go?
Yeah, maybe we're past stage. You know what stage one is? Stage one is, imagine where we were. Let's see. There's a good apologetic book that I forget who it was, but the author calls attention to the year 1960, where I think one of the descendants of Darwin is talking about it's the triumph of atheism. And evolution is held up, and this was when the Big Bang was held in disrepute, and then everything that's happened since then. And then imagine now, all of us we grew up roughly in that generation. I won't try to guess ages, but we're all probably some generation. And we're growing up in the aftermath of this supposed defeat, and we had to find ourselves. William Lane Craig is involved in that too. Okay, Hugh Ross is involved in that. Lots of apologists, where we had to. It's like the C.S. Lewis, How Do Fish Know That They're Wet? First you've got to discover, hey, this is not the way, and then you've got to say, well, okay, if I challenge all of these findings, it takes time to do work at that level and figure it out. Okay, so that's your left brain. That's us going off. That's Sy going off with the in this finding out what's going on in the cell, or Sarah doing the collapsing star research. Okay, it's like we're kind of at the end of that stage. We think we've got something. So now's the time. You said, can we push this back? And you got people like Hugh Ross and Father Spitzer on the Catholic side, William Lane Craig. Okay, so they were the pioneers of how do we reach back in a ministry, get this back to the public. And now you got people like you, Josh, who are doing this in the YouTube age. And there's lots of good Christian defenders out there doing that. How do we take what we learned, report back from the battlefield, so to speak, and make a difference? The train's derailed right now. Can we put it back on the track, or is it going to tumble down the embankment?
I think me learning from people like me that have a strong area in philosophy, learning from other people like you guys that are authorities in science and physics, biology, chemistry. I think we all have a part to play. We all are are of the body of Christ, and let's all keep going along, keep proclaiming the truth of Jesus Christ. Sarah, do you have any last words?
I think it's all been summed up pretty well.
Okay. All y'all's contact information is in here, or how you can get in contact with any of us on Twitter. Man, this has been great, guys. It's my hope that people will watch this and see that there are good reasons to be a theist, to reject the atheist narrative that you often hear. There are multiple reasons to be a theist, to dig deeper and to come to God, not least because of its explanatory thoroughness and how it accounts for all the data, and its explanatory richness, accounting for multiple layers of design and biology design in the cosmos, the way the physics works, the intelligibility of the whole process, the law-like features of it. So I think there are good reasons to be a theist and to be a Christian in particular. Thank you so much, each of you. And I guess we're going to call it end. So thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Bye-bye. God
Bye.
bless.